Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Production and Manufacturing Planning. This is the third event of our four-part FDA webinar series that will run through March 14th. I'm Rebecca Norman, your moderator and webinar organizer. I work as an innovation consultant for the Arkansas Small Business and Technology Development Center. We are a taxpayer-funded organization that provides consulting, training, and market research services for clients throughout the state. This Life Science Commercialization webinar series was funded through a federal and state technology award from the Small Business Administration in order to address identified needs for our life sciences, businesses, and entrepreneurs. The ASBTDC offers high-value market research services and guided support for innovative companies who are interested in exploring federal funding opportunities through the Small Business Innovation Research and Technology Transfer programs. Everyone will be receiving a copy of today's slides, as well as a link to the webinar recording within 2 days of this event. Before we get started, take a moment to make sure that you're ready and familiar with the GoToWebinar program. You should notice that you have a control panel on the right side of your screen. This panel can be minimized by clicking on the red arrow button in the upper left-hand corner. Looks like it's actually now orange. This program's been updated a bit. You can expand the panel by clicking on that button or minimize it that way. And second, you have the ability to submit questions using the question pane located near the bottom of your control panel. And so please do submit questions throughout today's presentation. We will have time at the end to ask those for our presenter, Jeffrey Skiba, and he'll have time to answer them following his presentation. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Today's panelist is Jeff Skiba. Jeff has over 28 years of experience leading medical device development and commercialization of first-to-market concepts. He is an inventor on over 25 domestic and international patents related to cardiovascular, orthopedic, OB/GYN, and treatment of biologic tissue. Jeff has authored and successfully received FDA clearance on multiple orthopedic and OB/GYN devices. Jeff created Vomeris Innovations Incorporated in 2004. He assigned his intellectual property and eventually capitalized the company, bringing in over 70 investors and raising over $12 million in private equity investment. He is the inventor of Vomeris Procellera wound dressing that has microcurrent technology. Jeff was the director of manufacturing and engineering at Trivascular, a California startup company, where he was involved in the development of a percutaneously delivered abdominal aortic aneurysm repair endograft, an FDA Class III PMA device. Jeff founded JBS Bioengineering, a startup company where he served as president. He headed the design and development of the surgical implant sector, where he was responsible for the development of a urologic implant system for type 3 stress incontinence, funded by a grant from the Office of Chief Scientist in Israel, and co-developed with an Israeli medical device firm. This device was granted FDA clearance and 2 patents. Jeff has developed a unique system for eye medication delivery. He has served as Vice President of Manufacturing and Engineering at Orthopedic Biosystems Incorporated. At this startup company, he directed the formation of the Research and Development Department, inventory management, regulatory submissions, and a world-class quality system approved by the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, as well as products stamped with the CE mark for orthopedic deep tissue implants and instrumentation. This company was eventually acquired by Smith & Nephew, an international orthopedic distribution company. Jeff was a founder and manager of technical services at International Polymer Engineering in 1992, where he was responsible for the research and development of expanded PTFE polymers and expanded PTFE production methods. Jeff, I'm now going to turn the presentation over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone to this part 3 of medical device design, regulation, and preparing for commercialization. The bio that was just read is an awful lot of work over many, many years, and I realized in creating these slides in this presentation is how complex the process really is, and how much how much information I need to impart. So what I tried to do is to create from a production engineering concept, design engineering, as well as from a CEO. I was CEO of the company for just under 10 years, creating these products and trying to keep value build into these products. So the gist of that is that I'm trying to create a presentation, a webinar that will help you to understand some of the complexities and some of the areas that are pitfalls that you can avoid, as well as being able to build value into your company, and also to build value into the project before the sharks come in and start to nibble on your IP and on your project. So with that, this session 3 is on quality, design, and production, and some of the concerns that you need to be aware of as you're getting involved and you're moving from your research evidence, your evidence-based medicine area, into how do I take my concept through and develop a quality system with adequate design background, documentation, and move that into a production concept, which should occur at this level. So I'm going to be going over the quality manual, proper controls, and documentation in the quality system. And this is the time that this needs to be done. After the product has been conceived of and you're starting to move it towards commercialization. Design controls need to be in place. You need to be preparing for transfer to production, getting some working prototypes, and freezing the design, which is probably, I'll go into this a little bit later, but probably the most difficult thing. You can always see a way to make it a little bit better. Production, we'll talk a little bit about cell-based manufacturing, lean manufacturing, and scalable manufacturing. These are all areas that when you get in front of a venture capitalist or any type of a venture raise, money raise, is that they're going to be asking questions along those lines. So we'll go into that a little bit. So this is kind of an overview of what we'll be discussing. Integrating the research, this goes back into session 2. As far as you've done the research, you're continuing to add into your research files. You've got a good filing system in place, and now you're talking about planning the production, freezing the design. When do you freeze that? What does that mean? Documenting the design freeze, and designing to manufacturing, which is subject of another webinar, how you design to manufacture. But years ago I had a chance to visit Allied Signal, and they had in their design group, they had a very interesting concept, is their design group had to pass all of their designs through manufacturing engineering. And the manufacturing engineering would iterate back to design saying some of these things are too expensive to build. And so there are companies out there that have specialists in manufacturing that will take your design and look at it and say, you know, if you can reduce this this tolerance or this little feature, you may be able to get this for half the cost. So manufacturing, understanding that manufacturing is very important. How feasible is it to manufacture? Can I do this on a small scale? And how do I transfer my design into manufacturing to where it's having the least amount of impact into my capital consumption? As everyone probably knows, having a small startup company with limited resources, you're always in the feast or famine mode, and most of the time you're in the famine mode. So you're watching your pennies, and when you're explaining all of this to a potential investor, you want to have all of this understood and easily explained. Cost of inventory, we'll discuss that a little bit later, but what is the real cost of inventory? How do I handle work in process, and how can that affect my lead times, and how do I integrate my quality system into all of this? And I use quality system as under the quality systems regulation that the FDA currently has, or under the ISO in medical devices, ISO 13485, that we have to be compliant with. and that should happen earlier rather than later. And the system is should be thought of as more of a quality management system or a quality management philosophy, that this is the way we're going to do business. One of the first things that we do is we try to develop a production flowchart, step-by-step description of the process steps, include the raw materials, where you get your sources, and what the lead times for those sources are. Those are important factors in determining where your capital needs to be placed. A lot of the raw materials are very specific. Some of them are not so specific. So understanding what you really want, the specification needs to be written for every activity and every raw material that you use, and including in that specification. And I do have some templates for that, so anyone who is interested and needs a template for that, you can email me at jeff.skiba@gmail.com, and I can help supply you with those. But when you're developing these design specifications, you should be developing those with the eye to a specification. How am I going to buy it? How am I going to inspect it? Or if I'm building it, how am I going to build it? How am I going to inspect it? How am I going to approve it? It's always a prudent idea to coordinate with suppliers to help write those specifications. If you're buying a particular product from or a particular raw material, to understand from the supplier what they can supply and what their range is as far as their upper limits and their lower limits, and what can you expect. Because if a product does have variation, you're going to have to test to those extremes of the specification, and then write a standard operating procedure to those step-by-step production flowcharts. Write a standard operating procedure in easy to read and follow language. Now, in many cases, just the flowchart by itself is adequate. In others, where the procedure needs to be more specific, you want to create much more detailed step-by-step instruction. And in an FDA audit situation, they will ask to see those. And so you're looking at a procedure. It shouldn't be in somebody's drawer. It needs to be out. It needs to be available. It should probably be posted at the site where they're actually doing the work. So in the design phase, we're developing these operating procedures so that they're linked to the quality and consistency of our output. Production planning, freeze the design. Again, I'm going to say that a lot, because once you freeze the design, you're not supposed to change things. Any change that you have to go back into what I call a effectivity study. I want to look at the effect of my change on my quality, and if my change is going to affect the quality, I have to go back and reassess whether or not I've covered that in my risk assessment, and whether or not I have the ability to retest. And if you significantly change the raw materials, for instance, you may put yourself back into retesting the biocompatibility and the toxicology of the product. Changes are costly. When the defect is, and by defect I mean this is when you see in your design that there's something wrong, you're going to have to change it. Cost of correction in the user requirement phase, and this was covered in the first webinar, talking about setting a user specification. What does the user want? To be able to change those, let's say he wants green and you say I can only produce it in black, typical Henry Ford color. You can pick any color you want as long as it's black. But if you said green, you've got to go back and change it. It doesn't cost much to make those corrections. But if you're all the way up to implementation, you're already in the market and you're selling the product, it could be millions of dollars. So everything in between needs to be passed through your risk analysis and documentation as to what change did this cause to my documentation, and what was the effect of the change to my product. So documentation is important and product is important. And let me double back on the product. In a medical device situation, And where you're looking at regulated and a highly regulated industry, the product is not just what you're going to sell in the box. It includes the box. It includes the packaging. It includes the labeling. It includes, nowadays, it includes the website. The FDA will be looking at websites. They will be looking at what you say and what claims you're making. And I should bring up, because I have this in a later slide, that in low-risk devices, in low-risk products, the FDA has kind of relinquished some of their oversight to the Federal Trade Commission. And that just came up after the last webinar, and I was looking into it to be sure that we were on solid ground, but sure enough, the FTC is now involved in enforcement of what you're doing and what you're saying. So production planning, you want to plan your production around a frozen design so that you're not going to have to go back and change your production process. You want to plan the transfer into production as a planned step that you're going to be moving from the lab into production. You want to look at cell-based manufacturing and scalable manufacturing. And it's called lean manufacturing today. That you want to look at the different aspects of the manufacturing and see if I can create a cell around it. And if you can, that's a very easy to explain going forward. It's a cell-based manufacturing is like building it in a box. So I have a fume hood, or I have a 10 by 10 little portable clean room. I can put that portable clean room anywhere in the world, and my manufacturing process can work within that. If it takes an awful lot of manufacturing space, you may be looking at a large building, and whenever you move from that large building to another building, you have to go back to the FDA and you have to report that you've validated and verified that all of your manufacturing process in the new building are adequate and it can produce the same product as what you had in the prior building. And all of this, it needs to be done with an eye to capital expense requirements, because capital is key, and how you spend that capital towards building your value in the company is critical, because you don't have that much capital to put towards building value. If all of it is in the research side, that can have a certain value. If some of it is designed toward understanding the manufacturing, that can have a value. Which ones are more valuable to an investor? All of them. So you try to cover all of these in the early stages. Murphy's Law is pretty important in all of this. If there's a worse time for something to go wrong, it will happen then. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong, and anything that can't go wrong, it will anyway. So I like these. Nature always sides with a hidden flaw, so you guys can have these to post on the wall. But if everything seems to be going well, you've obviously overlooked something. So in design documentation, when you're going through this, the original in the conception phase, the early on, you're probably looking at a lot of rough notes and napkins and drawings and designs. But once you start to move towards production, you're going to have to go back and really clean up all of your prior work. And usually you start with your lab books to make sure that they're signed and dated. And that includes having a witness to the design and discovery, having witness to changes in the design in the lab book. That's a pretty solid approach. If you ever are drawn into court and you have to defend the work that you did, and that does happen. I've been involved in those and had to sit in front of a judge and explain my lab book to the judge, and we were successful in getting an injunction against the people who were trying to move their project forward, but it was stepping on our IP. Engineering drawings, if you're going to be doing drawings for engineering, you need to understand the different size drawings and the different aspects of drawing design. There's the ISO has standards on it, ASME, and there's many different types of groups that are kind of standardizing these drawings. One of the areas that I found that was poorly understood was called geometric dimensioning and tolerancing, and that's something that you need to ask your design team about if they understand this. If you have parts that have to fit together, geometric dimensioning and tolerancing become critical. If you're not using the correct way of dimensioning your drawings, you could end up with parts that don't fit, and that goes back to the use of your funds. If you have to redo because of a drawing failure, and one part was a little bit, the high tolerance on one part was larger than the low tolerance on the other part, it's a square peg in a round hole. It's very difficult to make them fit. And keeping track of your revision histories. I had a situation once where I had a drawing, it was on Rev B. We had made some changes, and by the time I had gotten back to the drawing, we were up to Rev G. The design engineer I was using had gone back to Rev A and put the changes I wanted in Rev G to Rev A. All the changes in between B and G were lost and not included on the final drawing. So Murphy's Law says, well, go wrong, we'll go wrong. So you have to keep that in mind. You keep track of all of these research protocols and reports, flowcharts, raw material specifications, scientific literature. You're going to be gathering this literature probably on a daily basis. Have a good repository for those files and a method of documenting your bibliography, because if you will do a submission to the FDA, those files will be needed for support documentation. And under the e-filing of the FDA documents, you will have to put those into a specific format, not the entire document, but the citation will have to be in a format that the FDA is used to seeing. The competition file, again, as your design moves forward, having a competitor file where you've looked at other people's product that might be competitive, and having an understanding of those, and putting your thoughts and your documents together on that may not be of interest to you, but it's going to be of high interest to whoever takes this into marketing and sales. So as you're moving away from the design group now into the marketing group, they're going to need information. So what's good about yours, what's better about yours, what's not so good, all this kind of stuff needs to fall into that competitive file. And put these into a secure location. Lost data, lost records, you've got to go back and redo them is really a pain, and you've got to, it's costly to the company. The quality management system, or the quality management philosophy, is say what you do what you say, and record what you did. If you didn't record it, you didn't do it. That's the assumption that any auditor coming into your company will do. And I've been through many audits in the last 30 years where the FDA has come in, and it's not a pretty picture when they start writing. And so if you know what an FDA 483 is, or if you know what an FDA warning letter is, or if you know what a shutdown is, those are areas where all of a sudden you've got to dip into your bank to your capital bank and use capital to fix what they found out, and you prevent mix-ups. You have a system, and a good quality person, a good quality trained engineer will understand those systems so that you can keep the process in a low risk environment. I put FDR, I must have been thinking Franklin Roosevelt, but it's FDA, Quality Systems Regulation. Those are some words, some acronyms. The DMR, the Device Master Record. This is a record of all your documentation. Your device history record is the record of all of your production lots. So one is how you do the product, how you make it. This is say what you do. And the device history record is do what you say, and a record of what was done. So it's, I guess you could compare the DMR as if you were creating a recipe for a cake. It's how you came up with the recipe. The device history record is how you made a specific cake, and the record would be a record of what ingredients you used, who did the process, and who touched the product in production cycle. A quality manual is a set of policy, procedures, records, and forms that were created under the FDA today, which this is very important, is that this just changed about 12 months ago. It used to be a quality manual which you had to follow the requirements of the FDA under the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations 820, and I have links to these. Obviously in the first and second webinar, but all of the FDA stuff has moved into a risk management, a risk assessment concept. So a lot of your documentation now is going to be based upon your risk assessment and the mitigation that you have in place to prevent failures. The quality system is required before marketing a product. If you file a 510K and the FDA clears your 510K to market, or even, well, the PMA is much more rigorous, but either any of these under the FDA guidelines assumes that your quality system is in place before marketing. If your quality system is not in place or it's deficient and the FDA comes in and they deem you to be out of compliance enough, what they're saying is your product is mislabeled, because the assumption is with an FDA cleared product is that this quality system is in place, and they will come in and they have the ability to put chains and locks on your doors and keep you from doing business. So it's not a good time to find out that you've got to go back and rewrite your system. And I was in a company once where we got a 87-page 483, which is a 483 is a list of your deficiencies, and of that 87 pages, we had 4 product lines. 3 of those product lines were shut down. One of the product lines never came back. The other 2 were designed, and we were able to bring those back. But the FDA was very generous in that they didn't cite us for everything, but it was not a good environment, because all of us then had to drop what we were doing, and for the next 3 to 4 months all we did was redo the quality system, and we're already in production. So that's not a good way to use your time. Get the quality system in place. Don't be deficient. If you're going to go to Europe, you've got to have 13485, and you need to understand the ISOs and the ISOs requirements. International Standards Organization and the Quality Systems Regulation, they're trying to harmonize these two to get them very, very similar. If you're in 13485, you're probably going to be so close to the quality system that it's going to be an easy audit to get through. And I put down become auditable. An audit is when one of these outside groups comes in, takes a look at your documentation. Some of the things that they'll do is look at your complaints, look at your quality manual, look at your system, and see where you're deficient. And if you create an auditable trail, you will have the auditors come in and go out a lot easier. Now, a lot of people that I worked with wanted to say, well, they can just come in and figure it out on their own. If they have to figure it out and they have to sit there with you, you're going to have them in your office for a lot longer than if you can just provide them auditable trails of the work. So this is set up early in your design process, to where you've created a file and files. So going back up in the device master record, the device history record, everything is properly recorded, properly tabulated, to where I can hand the auditor this file, and they can look at it and say, I understand what you're doing, and this is an easy way to see this, and he's gone. You want him camped in your office? Start putting papers everywhere and have him have to go search for them. So this is just part of the quality management philosophy, is to be becoming auditable. Under the FDA guidelines, the FDA has required that management is responsible under Section 820. They're responsible for providing the resources and manpower required to maintain an adequate quality system. So the quality systems regulation are promulgated under the authority of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. They have the force of law, and management review is a specific requirement. So this management review is a systematic review of your systems, and if you have no documented management reviews, you will probably not be doing business very long, because this is a serious requirement. So get used to documenting your management review meetings. Now, management review meetings, what do they look at? Again, because of the FDA's risk assessment policy, what you're doing is prioritizing your risk and looking at those risks which pose your biggest impact on the quality and safety of your product, and whether or not that risk trend has gone up or gone down, and whether or not you're trending. For instance, how do you tell if your product, once it's out in the field, is trending positive? You don't have any complaints. If you have a lot of complaints and your complaints are increasing, there should be some kind of a response to that. During many of the quality system regulations audits, this was written by another individual, Mark Lynch. He said, 2 troubling aspects have always struck me. The first was a consistent lack of involvement of staff with executive responsibility. And guys, it's not that hard. Just when you have a meeting, have somebody record it. The first thing you want to do in the meeting, once you call it to order, is say, who's recording this? And somebody puts down and they record the essential elements of that, especially if you're talking about safety and efficacy of your product. So that's an overriding approach. If you're talking about the design, you're changing the design, you may be changing the safety. Did you talk about how the design change affected your safety and efficacy? Get used to doing that in the design phase, and it can be easily transferred into the production when you do the production transfer. Measuring quality. How do I make sure that my product is in that high quality characteristic zone? One of the ways is to transfer your research measurements into production and be realistic about it. If you're using a mass spectrometer to do your research and you want to transfer that over, take a look and see if you can find something that's a whole lot easier and a lot less expensive, because if you can keep those measurements, and you're going to find this in your product specification. And what I do in my product specifications is I try to put in what I want to buy, what I want to build, how I'm going to inspect it, and what my acceptance criteria are, and put that all in the same document. That way you don't have to go searching for a lot of that information downstream when you get into the production side. Is it realistic? Does it apply to or does it fall underneath? It's going to affect the quality of my product if it changes. One of the areas that are important is calibration. I have instrumentation. I have instrumentation used to measure the quality of the product, and if it's a part that has to fit another part, and my dial indicators or my calipers are not sufficient to measure the level of quality that I need to make that fit the way it's designed, you need to calibrate it to make sure. You need to make sure that the error that's introduced into that tool, from that tool, that the tool is accurate. And there's a good way of doing that, and it's called Gage Reproducibility Repeatability, or Gage RR. And this is looking at the error that is put into your production or your engineering tolerances and acceptable tolerances. So if your tolerance is plus or minus 3, but you're 0.03 of an inch, and your gauge is only good to plus or minus 5, you can see that your gauge can introduce so much error into your measuring, you're going to be accepting product that should be rejected. So you set realistic upper and lower tolerance limits. And the problem that we have today is with our computer, our PCs and CAD systems, is that the CAD systems are incredibly efficient, and when you zoom in on a corner, for instance, or on a line dimension, you can take it down into the millionths. But nobody ever builds to a millionth of an inch. I mean, unless you're in the space program, and these guys have to throw away so much product because they can't meet the spec. You need to set these limits to be realistic. Understand what the manufacturing tolerances are and where the breaks are from an engineering standpoint and a cost standpoint. I have what's called engineering tolerances and manufacturing tolerances as separate entities. In a manufacturing tolerance, you want to keep that a little tighter than your engineering tolerance because you want to use your engineering tolerances to dictate when you start to trend outside of an acceptable zone. The engineering tolerances would come in the management review meetings to say that they're still acceptable. However, we're seeing a trend toward either moving toward the high tolerance or the low tolerance, and we need to come back and make an intervention on the manufacturing process to bring my tolerances back. Now, all of that, how does that apply to where we at on in this cycle? This all needs to be determined in the design phase. So, so when you do transfer it to manufacturing, they're not doing research and design in manufacturing. They should just take this and run with it. And if there is a change, it goes back and it's very well documented to how you got to where you are. How do you prevent quality issues? Well, having to do with the FDA, if you're in the middle of a fundraise and you're trying to raise funding, if you're under the Securities and Exchange Commission fundraising, and that would be anywhere where you're offering a security as an offering of equity in your company, the Securities and Exchange Commission requires you to disclose any risk that might be associated with that investment, and an FDA warning letter is definitely has a definite negative impact on your valuation because there's no guarantee you can get past that. You may end up being shut down. So, so how do you prevent that? Well, one is having the proper attitude as you move forward, that having a good quality system is a good way of doing business. If you think of it as a burden or as just one of those things that you have to do, it's probably going to take you up into the warning letter category. You need to have the good attitude and a good philosophy that good quality products will bring value, and having a quality system in place will bring value into your company. And make sure that your SOPs, your records and forms are easy to use, and that they have only the data that you need, because I define this as placing burden on your company. So burden needs to be, documentation burden needs to be minimum but sufficient. So I've been in companies where it took 18 signatures on a document to how to rent a rental car. And I said, that's too much. And we've gone over the edge, and we have SOPs on how to rent a car. It has nothing to do with the quality of the product. So if you have a good understanding of that and you have a good auditing system, you can go in there and you can weed out some of this stuff that's not really necessary and keep it in the vein of having your quality system is designed to maintain your safety and efficacy of your product and keep the risk as low as possible. And you're going to do this through continuous training and good communication. And I've seen a lot of these psychological profiles, a lot of questions when they say, what is good communication? And I like to define it very simply as what to tell who and when to tell them. And if you have a good relationship where you know who to tell the information to, you don't hide it, you don't put it in your pocket, say I'll tell them later. If they need to know this, you need to know when to tell them. And there's another good saying. It says bad news does not get better with time. So developing a dynamic corrective action and preventive action system will work in your favor, and corrective and preventive action is a requirement of the FDA guidelines. So this is, if you do have problems, and the next slide I think I get into this, what to happen if you do get something, which is going to happen. having good geometric dimensioning and tolerancing. I just put this slide in because I thought that a lot of people may not have this. If you're doing parts like this, I realize that some people are not doing these types of drawings, but if you are, these are standard geometric dimensioning and tolerancing type drawings where the confusion at the manufacturing level, if you don't put something in, they will default to a manufacturing tolerance, and that's whatever their machine can give you on average. Otherwise, you end up throwing away a lot of parts. So you can see how detailed these parts can be in order to create that one part up in the upper right of this white side. So understanding what GD&T is and how that communicates to the builder how to build your part. This has to be done at the design stage. Setting those reasonable tolerances, setting upper and lower tolerance limits, and understanding what the alert limit is. As you start to move, if your part, let's say in this part, for instance, this part is 1 inch plus 0.006 minus 0.004. Now they could have split the difference and put 1.002, but this is the way that they chose to do this. So my tolerance was 0.010. Now if I go back and I do my Gage RR and I find out that the gauge is only good to 0.020, you can see that my gauge adds so much error into my system that I have to change the way that I measure it. And if you cannot understand how to measure this properly, then proving that your product will meet spec is next to impossible. And as you start to go through this, you will find that you're rejecting products, and so what do you do with those product rejects? And those end up going to your management review board to find out why you're getting rejects. And they will take the proper corrective and preventive action. In production process, a lot of companies do not have this in the production process. However, a production process capability study, if you know what a CP number is or CPK, these CPK numbers is basically will it consistently produce a quality product. And what you do is measure your product process capability. So a CPK is kind of the standard deviation of your standard deviation. So wherever possible, try to measure the process capability. This is a good key indicator in the early stages as to whether or not you can provide a process, a manufacturing process that will provide consistently high quality products. If it cannot, you need to go back and find out. And that's why this needs to be done early on in your design development stage. So a good link here is on how to measure that. And if you're using Excel, I believe there are actually you can use the Excel programs to calculate out these numbers. Dealing with the production rejects, to go back just a little bit, just to follow the procedure. Who can reject the product? Where does it go when it's rejected? You want to segregate these rejects from acceptable product. Now, what's acceptable? What's an acceptable area for reject? Is it a closet? Is it a place on the floor? Well, it has to be a properly designated quarantine area. And that could be stripes on the floor. It could be a place on the shelf, but it has to be adequately defined, and no one should be able to take things off the quarantine area. It now belongs to your quality department manager, who will then take it to the material review board and say, this is out of manufacturing spec, but it's still in engineering spec. Maybe we can accept it, maybe we should reject it. That's determined not by the quality person, but by the material review board, because these are the people, this should be your production person, your quality person, the president of the company, at a minimum, who look at these and make these decisions. So whoever the people are that signed off on the original material specification, these are the guys who will be involved in the material review board, because they're the ones who created the spec, they're the ones who need to modify the spec if it's not working in production, and they're the ones who are going to make this accept-reject decision. Now, what do you do with accepted product? It can flow back in your process flow. So in your production flow chart, you can put it as going back into production. What do you do if it's rejected? Well, rejected product, you have to have a destruction or a disposal process. And putting it in the garbage can, probably not a good idea. I was with one vascular graft company that we used to take all of our vascular grafts that were rejected. We had an 80% reject rate due to the quality of the raw material. It came in with little contamination. It can only be seen under a microscope. But the quality group made that as developed their own quality spec rather than going into the engineers. And the quality group, it changed the way that they looked at the product. And they used microscopes instead of ambient light at arm's length, which is where the engineers put it. So it was a big difference between how the product was examined under how you expect, go back to your product spec, how do I inspect this, how do I accept it? Well, the quality group had changed it, and we had to go back and through our management material review board, we had to go back and change that spec to arm's length, room light, and our rejects went to 20% rather than 80%. But the point of this was what to do with these rejects. We ended up having to, I ended up at a recycling company, and they pulled bags and bags of these materials. They were dumpster diving in the back of our company, and somebody was pulling these bags of rejects out and selling it as a recyclable. And these guys wanted to know how to recycle PTFE that had already been sintered, and there's just no way to recycle that stuff. So. But the question was, how are they pulling our products out? If those products, which were class 2 implants, had ever been taken out of those reject bags and put into pouches and labeled and sold on the market, we would have had a serious issue. So we changed our reject and destruction policy to make sure that we destroyed those products. And all of that was done under this corrective and preventive action concept. So where do problems arise in this development process? Changing your material suppliers, changes that your material suppliers make without telling you, and changes that are undetected by either the suppliers or the manufacturers. So if you're buying a raw material, do you take the manufacturer's word for it, or do you test it yourself, or do you send it out to a third-party tester? Those are important decisions to make, because every time you run a test, it costs you money. And if you have too many tests, it actually goes right into your cost of goods. Is your raw material testing procedures? They can cost a lot of money. Other aspects where you can make a decision that creates a problem is changes you make without telling the supplier. So you've developed a product specification in hand with your supplier, and then you make a change to that product specification. The supplier doesn't know about it. You need to have that. That's pretty common. And changes that result from undetected internal manufacturing process or control mechanisms, or both. So in your risk assessment, you are required to go through and do a risk assessment of the product to the consumer. You're also required to do what's called a process failure modes and effects. And this is where you're looking at your internal manufacturing processes and how your control on these produce a consistent quality product. And there may be part of the manufacturing process. Let's say that your manufacturing process is running, and all of your research has been around very small batches of product, and you start to run, instead of 1 hour a day, you're running 8 hours a day. Well, at 4 hours into the production cycle, your machines are heating up, and the heat from the process then goes back and changes your raw material slightly and pushes it out of spec. So do you have a good understanding of what your production process will do? Where does that occur? Hopefully not in production. I mean, production should have a good, solid process control, that they're not going to have to go back in and continually tweak the process, because in the original design we didn't go through all this. Other areas where problems arise is issues that come to light as a result of complaints or service requests, something that's unanticipated in the user environment. So this is why you have to have these management review meetings and your policies in place, because complaints or service requests, it didn't work as anticipated, or maybe the user specification and the user environment were not synchronized, and you end up with a product that didn't quite work the way it should. And we had one. We were working on a arthroscopic instrumentation set, and part of the arthroscopic instrumentation set required us to develop a handheld instrument that placed in the hands of an arthroscopic surgeon. Many of the surgeons liked it, many of them didn't like it. And so we met the original user specification in design, but when we put it in the hands of surgeons, we found that some surgeons are thumb dominant. It means that their thumb can actuate your grasper, your penetrator, your biter in the arthroscopic instrumentation. Some people are finger dominant. And what that does is it changes the way the arthroscopic instrument performs in surgery. And so we had to go back and make a decision. Do we make a change in the design so that we can accommodate both finger dominant and thumb dominant users? In the other areas where problems arise is people, improper training, shooting from the hip, making decisions when they should communicate with the group. So going back to the original slides, Murphy's Law will enter in if you let it. I wanted to discuss just briefly the raw material variability that you can encounter. And in the cases of these expanded PTFE vascular grafts that I was working on years ago, is that we would order raw materials from the factory that would polymerize the gas, the TFE gas, into a very fine granular material, looked like soap. But when you got down into the molecular structure of the polytetrafluoroethylene, we found that inside the lot there was variability. So if they manufactured, and it took them 8 hours to make a lot of material for us, at 8 o'clock you got a different product than you did at 4 o'clock. Now that happens also in titanium and stainless steel and pretty much just about any other material. It depends upon when you made it, what part of the day it was made. And so you need to understand the interlot variability as well as the intralot variability. So lot-to-lot variations and inside the lot variabilities can be enough of a change to your specification that it throws you out of spec. Part-to-part variability is something that you have to measure, and you set up your specifications in using the systems we discussed earlier. How to measure that variability, what are your acceptable variances, and are you complying with standards and standards of design? So if you're compliant to these standards, chances are that your variability will be minimized. You may not be able to reduce all of the variability, but you will have some, and that needs to be understood. Especially if you're going into test. At the test phase, you're going to have to test the low tolerance as well as the high tolerance, and it's testing the extremes. I put in a slide on Gage RR because I thought it was important. And I gave you a link to that also. And again, another link is the standard is that Gage RR needs to be less than 30%, and the system can be accepted, but there should be some plan to review that system if you're at 30%. Everyone's trying for a 10%, but if you're over 30%, the system has to be improved. That means that the appraisers and the equipment contributed more than 30% of the system variation. A very important understanding of how you do that. So you're going to be putting your instruments in the hands of at least 3 appraisers and using different equipment. If you're using different equipment, different machines, let's say you're using a dial indicator or a caliper, you use several different types of calipers to represent the variation in the caliper, as well as putting different appraisers in so that they can do this. And then there's a statistical formula that you follow using these this Gage RR, and that's, again, I believe that's in Excel. I went a little deeper into calibration with this one. Instrument calibration is a comparison of the measuring equipment against a standard instrument of higher accuracy. So if you're looking at a scale, and the scale says that it's accurate plus or minus a thousandth of a gram, was it tested against a standard instrument? Is it tested to a NIST, NIST, National Institutes of Standards, and is it at a higher accuracy so that you can document the accuracy of that equipment? How often do you calibrate? That's up to you. It depends on the use of the equipment. How often do you use it, and what are the chances that it goes out of calibration? You can have, if you're using, like, for instance, a scale, you can have a weight, or 2 weights actually. You want to have the high range and the low range, and measure that to see how accurate your machine is. And if it's outside of calibration, you need to bring somebody in, but you do need to have a document on a specification on how often you calibrate for every piece of equipment that you use in the process, either to control quality or to measure quality. That calibration needs to be documented on the machine. There needs to be a little sticker on the machine that says that it was calibrated, was found to be within the calibration range, that it followed a certain standard, and when the next calibration is due. And that usually falls, I put all of that underneath my quality director so that she would be able to make sure that we had good control on our quality. Validation and verification, you're going to be introduced to these if you haven't already, but to be able to validate your process is checking whether the specification captures the user needs, and verification is the process of checking that the product meets the user needs. So I put a little link at the bottom here on verification for medical type devices. So if your validation says that I meet my user needs and I verify that the product meets the specification, you've met the standard for this. Medical device reporting adverse events. I wanted to put this one in because it all goes back to your design and what happens if I have a failure. In the original design, you're not required to do medical device reporting until you start to sell it and it starts to be placed on people in the market. And so there's 4 good links at the bottom. The one at the very bottom is the MAUD search. MAUD is the FDA's website that you can go on and you can see what people are being cited for, what kind of deviations that's merited them some kind of a warning letter or a 483, and also what kind of problems that they've incurred. You're required under the FDA's guidelines to have an MDR, a medical device reporting specification, a procedure in place that if your product is involved in any adverse effect, that you have to report that to the FDA. I'm going to give you an example. You've got a patient in the operating room, and you've got let's say it's a patient warming blankets to keep the patient warm, and the patient dies on the table. You know about it. You've got to file an FDA MDR and do an examination and an evaluation of whether your product contributed to the death on the table. Any serious adverse event may be associated with the medical device, any user errors, product quality issues, and therapeutic failures. Now the FDA is asking users to use this website. So it encourages healthcare professionals, patients, and caregivers, consumers, to submit these voluntary reports. So if a nurse or a doctor files an adverse event report and the FDA goes into their files and they don't see that you filed it, but in their report it says that the doctor called the company and the company knows about it and you didn't do anything about it, you're in a little hot water. So you don't want to go there. So this is kind of what happens if you don't have this medical device report in place. So these links will help you understand that a little bit better. So this, again, go to this site, this mod search, and see how some people have failed. I always say that that's probably one of the best ways to understand what they're after, is how people are failing. Over 60% of the warning letters issued by the FDA contain a citation against the company's complaint handling and medical device reporting practices or procedures. So it's obvious that people are not paying attention to this. So if you have a complaint, how do you handle it? If it's a really bad complaint, you know, I put this device on my daughter and she got a big rash and I had to take her to the doctor. Well, you need to research that and report it to the FDA. These devices are highly regulated, and you want to verify that your final design is not conflicting with the indications for use. And because the indications for use, as I went over in the second webinar, the indications for use drives the FDA strategy. Today, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is now involved in low-risk devices. So if your device is considered low risk, the FDA may not be involved in it, but they have turned these cases over to the FTC. Why is that important? Well, the FTC does not have guidelines as the FDA may have in the higher risk devices. They do require you to have truth in advertising, and the FTC is enabled to do some things that are not very pleasant for a company, especially if you're in a money-raising mode. So your responsibility with both the FDA and the FTC is to know the requirements of your device and plan and design your documentation for an audit. Stay away from recalls. I mean, a lot of people, they just happen, but you know, properly designed product in the design phase, you can reduce the risk for recalls. And there's a lot of guys down here below in nice suits who are fishing for products. Now, I put this little hip on here. This is the acetabular cup for a hip implant. This was, very simply put, this was recalled because this surface was a machined surface and it still had the cutting oil on it, and there was no procedure for removing the cutting oil, and it went into patients. And cutting oils in the machine process loosened the implant, and the implants failed. So the company, what did that do to the company? Let's see, I think I've got that one. What did that do to the company? Well, they had to recall the products. And in the case of this implant, the hip implant, their company had to be rebranded. And that was a European company, and nobody would buy that hip implant under that name anymore. So your design and your design documentation and your specifications all need to be updated and directed towards the design process, the manufacturing process, how I inspect, how I look at the entire process to make sure that things don't happen. So here's a couple of taken off a list of recalls. Electric shock delivery, failure to deliver electric shock. This is a defibrillator. This is designed to deliver electric shock, but it didn't work. This one, they recalled a shoulder, and you can see right here on this part, it broke. So in the geometric dimensioning and tolerancing, my guess is they did not look at this interface and this interface to make sure that there was enough strength on this implant under the loads that it was going to see to make sure that there wasn't a failure mode present. And in this case, obviously there was. So they had a high fracture rate. And at some point they said, this is not an isolated incident, this is something in the design. And so they go back to the guys that designed it and say, we got to redesign it. And that's That's not a good way to do business. Gather your evidence. This is one that I was just exposed to last week. This is what the LA Times was saying. If you weren't smart enough to know that Lumosity was making bogus claims, the FTC has your back. I mean, these guys are fishing for stuff, and Lumosity is a little website that says if you do our brain exercises, you're going to reduce your chances for Alzheimer's dementia. If that's the case, where's your evidence? And they were able to get a $50 million judgment on Lumosity, and they ended up having to pay $2 million. They settled at $2 million. And their bottom line was simply did not have the science to back up their ads. And you're going, but this is a low-risk device. The FTC doesn't care. You've got to have evidence. You've got to show your evidence, and it has to be acceptable to your peer reviews. So what's the rationale for doing it right? Well, the hip implant that I mentioned earlier was a $1 billion settlement. Now, how much research can you do for $1 billion? Can you do it right? I think so. So this is the rationale why you do it, why you do your design up front, and get all of your risk analyses done at the front end, and don't wait until it's out in a patient. We talked a little bit earlier about the cell-based manufacturing as far as driving your valuation. Keep this in mind. It keeps the cost of inventory low. Raw material and inventory equals capital. That's money on the shelf, and inventory is capital on the shelf. If you have too many SKUs, you're going to load your shelf up, and that costs you money. And if you change your branding, you're going to end up having to change all that inventory, all your boxes, all your labels. Everything has to be thrown out, and you've got to start over. It's not a good place. So start small, make it scalable. Investors will be looking at this to see if you can start small, because investors like to see their money used not to build inventory, but to build production, manufacturing, and they want to see products going out that have low risk to their investment. Know what it takes to build from the start. And just-in-time manufacturing in the beginning may be challenging because you don't know what your lead times are. You will know those minimum order quantities and what your economies of scale are going to be. Document this in your design file, and you'll eventually get to what's called a transfer to manufacturing, or a handoff. If any effects of changes that may affect the quality of the device may require a restart of the studies, may require reapplication to the FDA, so see when to refile a 510K. That's the link down below. But always have to ask that question. That's going to occur in your management review meeting. Do we need to, we've made a significant change, do we need to refile? There's additional links that you can go through here: GD&T basics, understanding Gage RR, the AMI.org, NIST, and ISO.org, validation, verification. All of these will come in handy in your bibliography. Oops. So that is part 3 on this this 4-part webinar on quality design and production. I hope it was educational. Do we have any questions? I turn it back over to the moderator.